Hello, hi everybody. I'm Emily Greer, and I really appreciate anybody who is spending 45 minutes today on this weighty topic and really engaging with it. There's a couple of things I want to start out with just to let you know how it's going. This topic is so big that I have more than 45 minutes of content in the deck, and I'm going to have to go through it really fast. I've got notes on everything that I wanted to say, and I'm going to release the deck with all of those notes so you can see it at the end. The other is that I have a lot of good place gifts in here, and that's because it's one of my favorite shows, and I think it talks about a lot of the issues here, only as much funnier and much more philosophical and on a grander scale. So to give context to how I'm going to talk about harassment and abuse, I'm talking about it from the perspective of leadership and what leaders can do. And that comes in the context of my own experience, which is 14 years in games, all of it as a co-founder and leader of a company. Most of you know me from co-founding Congregate back in 2006. I left there a year ago and have started a mobile game studio called Double Loop now. But most of this talk is going to be referencing my Congregate years because that was 13, and because we went through the whole journey there from just 2 founders all the way up to 120 employees. We were part of GameStop for 7 years. We had 2 offices almost from the start, but had 4 offices and 120 employees by the end. So really went through kind of a big spectrum of growth, and that is, and learned a lot and made a lot of mistakes, and I'm going to talk about that here. So over the last few years, there's been kind of waves of harassment allegations coming out kind of every 6 months or so. And if you look at those, they really cross the whole divide of the industry. You see lots of AAA publishers, but you also see, tiny, small indie studios being mentioned, technology companies, game streamers. Everybody seems to be impacted by this problem. And even though so much has come out, if you talk to women in the industry, the sentiment that you're going to hear again and again is that we're surprised that more hasn't come out, because this just feels like the tip of the iceberg from what we know from our own stories and what we have heard from our friends. And the statistics that you see for the US broadly kind of sort of support our feeling that we still really haven't heard that much. From the US Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the EEOC, which I'm going to reference many times, released a really great report in 2016 that had a lot of stats, and other surveys support this as well. And it shows that 60% of US women and 20% of US men have experienced sexual or gender-based harassment at work. Sexual or gender-based harassment, almost all of it at work. Now, what's the difference between sexual harassment and gender-based harassment? Sexual harassment is unwanted sexual attention. Gender-based harassment is harassment based on your gender, but not necessarily with sexual intent. Now, these 2 categories are a little fluid, because especially you find that a lot of gender-based harassment uses sexual terms, but it is still good to think about them separately and to include both of them. And it's not just sexual harassment. This shows all of the complaints that the EEOC got in 2015. And while gender and sex is the #1 category, race is not far behind, and a lot of other categories show up as well. Note that these add up to more than 100%, and that's because people can fall into multiple categories at the same time. Intersectionality, as it's called. And it seems from what the data seems to show is that people in underrepresented minorities report similar levels of harassment as women. And it's not hard to assume that people who are in multiple categories experience an even more disproportionate amount of harassment. So when cases come out and stories come out, it's really easy to sort of shudder and say, God, that's awful. I had no idea, and think, well, it's good. It's been revealed. Now that person is out of the industry and we can move on. But there's been so many cases across so much of the industry that I think it's time to really grapple with the fact that it's not just one company, it's not just a few people, it's systemic, and bad actors are flourishing in games at a broad scale. So, knowing that, it's pretty easy to get mired down in sort of the fact that, humans can really suck. And easy to think, this is inevitable. There's not much we can do. It happens in lots of industries, not just games, and throw our hands up. But, I wouldn't be giving this talk if I thought it was inevitable. I have sort of general theory of how humans behave, and because I'm me, I put it in chart form. I can't do a talk without chart. But that general philosophy is that there's some small percentage of people who will be good and kind and respectful and supportive in any situation. And there's a small percentage of people who are sort of true predators, who are truly cruel and will be terrible in any situation. But most of us are ordinary, and most of us are reacting to the norms of the people that we're around, and we're in the middle, and we live up and down to what we see around us and what we think is expected of us. But are those group norms fixed? They're not. In companies, there's a series of things that strongly influence group norms. What's modeled by leaders, what's rewarded or incentivized, think like the Wells Fargo scandals from a few years ago, what behavior is tolerated, and then cultural norms of individual employees and places they've worked in the past. Now, if you look at those, the first three are all things that the leaders have direct influence over and generally direct control. And that means that leaders of companies have tremendous, tremendous impact on the norms of those companies. Uber is a really great case study of that. Travis Kalanick, the founder, it's a little indifferent to rules. I think it can be safely said. Uber was founded with the desire to sort of, undermine and ignore taxi regulations. And that kind of attitude created a great new industry, but it also created a sort of pervasive atmosphere where rules did not matter and legality did not matter. And that became very clear when Susan Fowler did a blog post about the sexual harassment, really egregious sexual harassment that she experienced from her manager there. But that was ignored, even though there were many, many complaints of women, because he was a high performer and, too important to let go. Now, that all came to a head, and Kalanick was ousted from the CEO, but you can see that it was really, kind of top to bottom. It wasn't just the leader. It infiltrated the whole company. On the other side of it, you see Big Huge Games, which has, goes back to 2000, focus at Baltimore studio that focuses on strategy games. They went under when 38 Studios went bankrupt back in sometime in the 2000s, and they decided to reboot in 2013. The leadership was really shocked by what was happening in Gamergate and decided to really focus on changing the culture and making it more inclusive and diverse. And the rebooted company, even though it had a lot of the same team and a lot of the same leadership, had really different group norms than the original version of the company. I think it would be a great GDC talk, and I hope Tim Train and the others there will sometime talk about it because they've really done a lot. So the thing is, Uber's a really successful company. Does it matter if my company's culture is toxic or even just a little bit neutral? There are a lot of reasons why it really is a problem. The costs are real, and it starts with the very real pain that individuals who experience harassment and abuse suffer, all the way up to what can just frankly be called PTSD. And all of those costs, physical and emotional, end up rolling up into organizational costs. Looking at this list of things that the EEOC cites, it's not just the people experiencing harassment who have debilitating job dissatisfaction or who are avoiding the team member or consider leaving. People who witness harassment also have a lot of those same emotions and feelings, and it affects much more broadly than just the one person. You also see lawsuits and reputational damage and hiring and recruiting impacts. And if you think about it, all of these sorts of things have hit riot in the last 2 years since the Kotaku article came out. And does anybody really want their company to go through that? Not really. So far, all I've talked about are sort of negative things that you want to avoid, costs that can hit you. But there's a carrot too, and that's that your team will be more effective if you eliminate abuse and harassment. And it's not just coming from me. The basis comes from a lot of research on psychological safety. Psychological safety is when team members feel safe to take risks and be vulnerable in front of each other. And Google, who've done extensive research on teams, has found this to be far and away the number one most important factor in team effectiveness. There's 4 others there, but psychological safety was really, really crucial. And it's not just Google who's seen this. The Games Outcomes Project, which researches games projects specifically from indie teams to AAA, found that psychological safety and team trust was one of the very few factors that strongly correlated with the financial and critical success of games. And when you think about it, how can any member of a team feel safe if somebody on that team, whether it's them or not, is getting abused and harassed? You're never going to feel comfortable and safe and trusting in that environment. So hopefully now you're ready to absolutely eliminate harassment and abuse in your company. But to do that, you really need to understand what's driving that. And to do that, and it's not what people always think. And to help eliminate that, I'm going to tell a story of my own, going back to a GDC from 11 years ago in 2009. I was been in the industry about 2.5 years, a little less than 3, since we started Congregate, and I was still very much on the fringes. This was the first time I started to be included. I was invited, or actually my brother was invited to a dinner organized by a AAA company. He couldn't go, so I was subbed in. And first big party that I've gone to attached to GDC. And I had a great time. I sat next to really interesting people. We had a great discussion. I was feeling really warm and included and part of games for the first time. As the dinner went on, people started to get up and leave and mingle and talk to people who are in different parts of the table. I talked to several people, and probably around 10 p.m. I was talking to very senior exec from one of the fast-rising social game companies that were sort of the big news of the time. And we started talking about a potential distribution deal because Congregate, while we weren't making tons of money at that point, we had a lot of traffic. So we're talking about that deal, and then suddenly his language just totally changed, and he started talking about it in sexual terms. You know, that we don't need to get married. We could make this deal a one-night stand, and starts making sexual hand gestures at me, and I think the blowjob gesture as well. And I was sort of like really taken aback and shocked. Like, what just happened here? Is this a quid pro quo? Does he want me to have sex with him to get a distribution deal? Is this what he thinks is going on? Whatever it was, I was, you know, kind of grossed out and freaked out, and I quickly said goodbye, and I left, and I grabbed a taxi, and I remember being in the taxi feeling kind of, you know, really small and dirty. I really wanted a shower. I remember that. And all that lovely feeling of belonging and that I was, you know, kind of meant to be there had evaporated. But, you know, tomorrow's the next day. I tell my brother and some coworkers, but didn't really feel like there was anything to do and kind of moved on, except for that I couldn't stop thinking about it. And one of the things that always really puzzled me about this story is if that guy really wanted me to sleep with him or do a deal, either one, that was a really terrible way to go about it. Absolutely terrible. Like, there was no way that I would consider sleeping with him under those circumstances. And, you know, over time, that helped me get to the insight, which is really broadly supported, that harassment is sometimes about sex, but it's always about power. He was getting a thrill out of having something that he could throw at me that I might be willing to have sex with him for, right? Like he felt like sort of big swinging man because of that. And even though I was sort of grossed out and pulled away, he probably got a thrill out of that too, pushing my buttons, grossing me out. It goes back to the playground that's kind of its own power move. Now, this is an environment where, that company was bigger and more famous than mine, but there's no sort of direct hierarchy between us. But when you get into, employee to employee abuse and harassment, especially in toxic and hierarchical environments, harassment is usually used to enforce the pecking order and to control and push out rivals. If you're a man, you might be called a fucking idiot or a racist or homophobic slur. But if you're a woman, it's nearly always going to be phrased in sexual terms. I think this quote that came out of one of the Liberación articles on Ubisoft really shows that dynamic where the creative director was pushing down on a woman who was asking something of him in a very, very graphic sexual language. Now, gender is what I've talked about quite a bit, but I think it's good to abstract to think of this as in-group versus out-group. Now, the in-groups and out-groups are going to line up usually along the lines of things that are in-groups and out-groups of the society we come from. So gender and race and class, sexual orientation, things like that. But really they can be almost anything as well. And these things can layer on top of each other. They could be what part of the industry you're in, or what you look like, or are you dev team or publishing team? Almost anything can be the fault lines for in-groups and out-groups. And so it's helpful to think about it that way, especially because, what's going to be strongest in the US might be totally different in Japan or Europe or Latin America. However, I do think with the games industry, gender is always going to be a really strong part of it, in part because it's set in this broader context of the gaming culture that is very proudly sort of a boys' club. Now, it's hard to tease out cause and effect here because they definitely reinforce each other, but I do think that gender is probably the most universal within games. This is again backed up by research from the EEOC. They put together a list of major workplace risk factors for harassment. And you look at this list and most of them have to do with in-group, out-group, and power disparities. You also look at this list and almost all of them occur in the games industry. So it's not surprising that we have a harassment problem. The other thing to think about is that harassment happens on a continuum. There's things that you can look at and say, oh, that is clearly harassment, that's clearly illegal. But it's generally happening within a context where there's lots of things that led up to it and that are not necessarily illegal, but they might be if they're happening enough. Companies have been focusing for a long time on just sort of eliminating illegal harassment and the most egregious stuff. But to create a safe environment and to create a respected environment, you have to deal with that whole spectrum, which includes a lot of things that are sort of more accepted and more gray area in order to really create a culture of respect. And you can't half-ass this. I can't emphasize this enough. Your culture is defined by what you choose to do when it's inconvenient, not by what you say when it's expected. Everybody can see through PR pieces that are, oh, we're sorry, oh, we can do better, or check the box harassment trainings that are required by the state. We know what you think is important by what you give your time, your attention, and your budget to. And you're going to need that to really deal with harassment. Because harassment is so much about power, the most underlying factor that you can use to create cultures of respect and to reduce harassment is to minimize the power differential between people, or at least the perceived importance of that power. That doesn't mean going to holacracy or some other kind of flat organization. Harassment can thrive just fine when in a world with no bosses. But it does mean that you need to think about the separation and of people in your organization and what that means and how it's perceived. To put it in games terms, you want a balanced party. In a culture of respect, in-groups and out-groups fade because everybody values the different experiences and the different skills that people are bringing to the party, and you need a whole party working together to beat the monster or create a great game. But to get to that kind of culture, you need to fight the leaderboard mentality, where people are thinking of it as a hierarchy, where they are rising and getting higher if they're pushing somebody else down and pushing them down below them. One of the best ways to eliminate the power differential is for leaders to essentially invert it in their mind. And there's a sort of concept of servant leadership that I think is really useful there, where it becomes not about the leaders being, the big people who are in charge and important. Their job is to serve the people doing the work broadly and empowering them and teaching them and listening to them and rising them up. In broader culture, one of the most famous examples is Costco, which really focuses on making their jobs great for the employees and are rewarded with tremendous retention and loyalty. They've done things like in the last financial recession, they actually gave their employees a raise when sales were down because they felt their employees needed it. In games, I think Supercell is a culture that, whether they think they follow this or not, this is very much kind of the model where the CEO is there to serve the games team. Another thing that I personally went through as Congregate grew was that I needed to learn how to watch my words in a much more, in a very different way. I'm sort of quick to say things and say a lot of things off the cuff, and that was totally fine when we were 5 employees, even when we were 15 employees. But as we grew and people came into the company knowing my name and thinking I was important as a CEO, I had to change how I talked to people. I still felt like the same approachable, easygoing person, but they had a lot of natural fear of me, and I needed to be very careful about things that I said, either praise or criticism, and I needed to think about those casual remarks. So I encourage anybody who is in leadership and going through it to think about, okay, what's your self-image versus how your employees think about you, and really think about how you talk to them. Another thing that we struggled with sometimes at Congregate was distinguishing lack of conflict, niceness from respect. It's really important for everybody, whether you're individual or a company, to be able to hear criticism and act on it in order to really grow and flourish. And there's a lot of companies where, in trying to get away from people being abusive and cruel, you get into the norm where nobody can say anything critical. And that's not great. You need to be able to express thoughtful criticism, and you need to be able to deal with the things that are bad and are important. And you need to be able to fire somebody, because if you can't, undercover harassers are going to thrive. So think about that distinction. Am I being nice, or am I being truly respectful? I could talk about communication all day, and I don't have that time. So I'm just going to point out these 2 books that I think have been very helpful for me, and I think can be very helpful to anyone. And I encourage everybody to spend a lot of time on working on their communication. One thing I think is really important is to set the tone early with new hires. People come in feeling insecure, and both helping them see what's expected and also making them feel safe is really important very quickly. A couple of things we did at Congregate. One is that I went out of my way to greet every new hire, didn't wait for them to be taken around to greet me, and made sure that they knew that I knew who they were and thought that they were important. And I heard from a lot of people when I left, that was actually specifically really meaningful. It only took 5 or 10 minutes on their first day, but it really set the tone of what the company was like and what I was like. So I highly recommend it. New hire orientation was also great. And one of the things I think was important in there was that I put in a slide sharing my worst mistake, which is that I said no to Minecraft. Really big mistake, right? And we have a successful company anyway. And because I wanted very quickly for employees to know that it was okay to be vulnerable and it was okay to make mistakes. And the fastest way to do that is for me to show that I had really effed up. Another thing is you should have no VIPs. There shouldn't be special travel rules or special vacation policies for people who are executives. Everybody should fundamentally be treated the same, and that includes, access to, bonus programs or equity. Even if they're participating in a much smaller rate, everybody should be able to be included. The other side of that is sharing communal responsibilities, things that everybody needs to do. A rotating kitchen duty was really effective at Congregate, and I think it was always really powerful for people to see my name and my brother's name on that list and to see us in there doing something that was serving them. People talk a lot about transparent communication and access to leadership. It's really common for companies to do regular business updates, but you really need to go beyond that for best results and have everybody feel like they can really reach out and talk to leadership, and that leadership will be honest, and that includes not just cheerleading, but also talking about real challenges and how we're addressing that. Having any kind of system where people can ask anonymous questions really is helpful, because that even if they don't use it, the fact that we're willing to take anonymous questions really opens up the feeling of trust. Getting people to talk to other levels through skip level one-on-ones, things like that is really great. And definitely think about remote employees and people at other locations to make sure that they have similar access. You also need to actively look for red flags. There's always going to be some people who are charming and cooperative with you, but the kiss up and kick down type of personality who behave very differently with others. So to look for those, you need to not look just at how they behave in front of you, but look at signs of how they're behaving elsewhere. Here's a list of things. You definitely want to do exit interviews. You definitely want to watch out for anybody who's regularly getting into any kind of feud with peers or other types of groups, because those are red flags that are very serious. The most serious harassment case I had dealt with at Congregate, that was employee to employee, the manager involved had pretty much all of these flags over his tenure. Now, this is a topic I can't go into very deeply, but one of the most important ways we show how we value people is how we pay them and how we promote them. And there's a lot of common practices, especially in US compensation, that create disparities over time. I created a scenario here looking at a bunch of different junior hires that hopefully you can go over later. But the thing that I want you to take away is to answer this question. If everybody in your company's pay and compensation was released publicly tomorrow, could you defend it? If you can't, that means that you need to do more work in terms of analyzing the equity between people and the equity relative to the market, and you need to do that on a regular basis. So you probably noticed on the previous EEOC slide that one of the factors for harassment was workplaces that tolerated or encouraged alcohol. And we all know this is true in the games industry. I've certainly been a problem with that over the years. I've had a lot of fun nights out with employees and industry friends drinking. But I've also seen the problems with that, including, an indie dev who got blackout drunk and followed me around a party, trying to hug me and announcing that I was going to be the future mother of his children, and other things that were just really awkward for everybody. Over time at counteract, we managed to make the culture less alcohol centric, and part of that was how we organized events, the times, how we did things, making sure there was always food. The one shit showy holiday party we had was because there was not enough food. But also making sure there was no peer pressure to drink. We played beer pong on a regular basis, but it was totally common practice for people to play with water in their cups because they were sick or they didn't like beer or they didn't drink, and that was totally okay. And you need to make that okay within your company. Dating is another element in sort of fun things that become pretty problematic quickly. I put in a base policy here. Everybody should have a base policy. One thing that I would add on top of that is that you also really need to think about that people above a certain level, it doesn't matter what the reporting structure is, they're always going to have a power differential with the people below them. And I think especially for the top level, founders, C-level, and anybody in HR, you should have dating be strictly prohibited. There's no situation in which that doesn't end up being messy and a breach of trust. And you really don't want any situation where somebody high level is treating the company as their sort of personal Tinder pool. I also have a spicy take that employees are more likely to date each other if they're working, 70, 80 hours a week and not seeing other people. So don't crunch, and it's less of a problem. But even with all of these things that have happened and that you're doing, you need to be realistic that there's still going to be abuse. You can get the vast majority of the group to sort of better, more respectful norms, but there's always that percentage of people who are going to want to be abusive and kind of get off on that. And you need to be prepared, especially because once you've changed the surface culture and the group norms, then it's going to go underground. People are going to know it's not okay, but they're going to figure out ways to make it more covert, more discreet. And that means you need to work harder to find it and deal with it. So a little context here. I'm going to tell another short personal story, and this is from the time that we were owned by GameStop. I was at a party at the buffet line, and the GameStop exec we worked with was on one side of me and then went to the other side of me, and in that process took advantage of reasonable touching me to actually grope me. And very typically, I froze. What happened? Did this really happen? I didn't want to make a scene, but so I just sort of walked away and didn't deal with it right then. But once the party was over, I told my brother about it. And he was really skeptical. He thought I must have imagined it. It didn't really happen. And I remember thinking, well, I'm 4'11". No normal height man naturally touches the lower part of my ass and groin area. I really don't think this was accidental. You have to bend your knees. You have to reach to make this happen. But if my own brother, who loves me and respects me, doesn't think this is true, what's the point of going to HR or talking to anybody else about this, right? The man would deny it. I'd get into a fight. Nothing would happen. I damaged my position within GameStop and have created an enemy, and it just didn't seem worth it. And so I decided to do nothing. But it still continued to bother me over the years. And I was, angry that he got away with it. I was worried that he was doing, that and worse to other women, and I hadn't done anything to prevent it. I was also really sort of disappointed with my brother on that. The good news is that after Me Too came out, we talked about it, and he's really apologetic now and gets it. And I don't want to talk badly about GameStop because this story isn't really about GameStop. I found the culture there to be totally fine, or I wouldn't have stayed for many years past my earnout. In particular, I really came to like and respect my boss. But even in a sort of a typical company with a not very bad culture, I really didn't feel safe making a harassment complaint. And that is totally typical. Only a tiny, tiny fraction, 1 in 10, 1 in 15, 1 in 20 of harassment and abuse cases ever gets reported. And per the EEOC, it's all exactly the same reasons why I didn't report to GameStop. And everything I did was exactly totally typical. So when you think about preventing harassment, you need to think about creating systems that break through this. How do you make the victim feel like they're going to be believed before they report? How do you make them feel like something is going to be done to really deal with this? And how do you make them feel safe to actually tell you about it? The other thing that goes along with this is that you actually need to accept that getting harassment reports is actually positive, because it means that your employees have faith in the system and they have faith in you to take it seriously. Going to social media, going to the newspapers, going to a lawsuit, these are all sort of the actions of people who have no hope of any other recourse. So if you get a harassment complaint, even if it feels terrible, it actually is a positive thing and means that you're doing something right. So what kind of systems do you need? First of all, you need a real harassment policy, not just something you pick up the internet or your legal or HR prepares. It needs to be something that's accessible and specific and not at all generic, and everybody can understand. And it needs to cover that whole spectrum, not just what's illegal, but what's inappropriate and everything that you don't want to be happening in your company. And then you need to give that to your employees and get their feedback, because nobody is going to know what's the real situation and what the dangers are in your particular context more than your employees. And once you incorporate that feedback, you're going to have something that people have bought in on at a different level. So do that. That's the first starting point. The other thing is make concrete plans as much as possible. When something unexpected happens, especially something complex and stressful, our first reaction is to freeze. You've seen me do that in multiple situations. And when people freeze, inaction is the default response. The more that you plan in advance, the more that you think things through, the more that you give clear paths for escalation, the more quickly and the more consistently you will. So, set up a small group that consistently things. Get practice in terms of taking investigations and things like that. Identify things like GDC or the company holiday party where stuff is more likely to happen, and develop a mitigation plan, including things like having food there and having a point person and sending out an email in advance saying, if anything happens, please come to this person and then they will help you deal with it. All of that helps. One thing I also used to do is reach out to higher risk groups. So because most of my negative experiences were interacting with the outside world, I would talk to our BD people and tell them, if this happens to you, if you see something, please come to me. It's happened to me. I will believe you. So they would know that I was there. I think interns in particular is a group that you should think about, as they're going to have less resources in terms of connections to other people or understanding of what's normal in the workplace. And you need to prepare for ambiguity. If you think about both of the cases that I've reported and told you about here, there's no witnesses, there's no evidence. It's only, me versus what that person would say. And that's going to be common. There's also going to be stories that have a mix of consensual and non-consensual behavior, or, bad behavior on both sides, or, bad choices, all of those things. And you're going to have to think about them and come to some sort of synthesis of, what the truth is. But you need to do that in the context of understanding how difficult it is for reporters to report. They're taking a lot of risks. And, when you think about a court of law, It's absolutely, absolutely right that the system should be innocent until proven guilty. But when you're thinking about an internal investigation, are you ready for this to happen to another employee? Maybe 10 or 20 more employees before you get even one more report? You need to think about what, given the severity of what happened, what balance do you want to strike there and what makes sense? But that doesn't mean that you want to fire everybody. People will often talk about zero harassment policies, but those can really backfire because they mean that people won't necessarily report something more minor because they're afraid of getting people fired. You need to look at, what's the context? What was the intent? What's the pattern? Were they drunk? All of those things to help put together what the correct response is in any situation. And hopefully it's going to be just some sort of warning or talking to or therapy or some other situation, something like that. Part of respect is having faith that people can learn and grow and change. But the caveat with that is that anything predatory or very cruel still needs to be dealt with swiftly and harshly. You also really need to think through the fact that no one can be too valuable to fire. In the Games Outcomes Project, besides team trust and psychological safety, one of the other factors that was really, really crucial was clarity of vision for the game. And that actually being really important, I think, has made the games industry fall very hard for the myth of the asshole genius. But you have to question, are they really more of a creative visionary, or are they just better at talking over people than other people? Are they good at stifling dissent? Are they better at taking credit for somebody else's work? We often mistake aggressiveness for leadership as humans. And once this pattern sets in, it self-reproduces because younger people think that's what they're supposed to act like. And more collaborative creative visionaries might get forced out or not recognized because the pattern has been set. I'm a big basketball fan, and there's a stat called plus minus, which looks at the effect, the whole team's output when the player is on the floor, because that helps distinguish what effect are they having on their team and their teammates from what their individual stats are. And I think a lot of these sort of asshole creative geniuses, should be looked at in that kind of context. They may look good from one particular frame, but they're the reason why people quit. They're the reason why people are afraid to criticize the game. They're the reason people are afraid to make suggestions. And games is absolutely a team effort outside of, solo indie projects. They're always going to be judged on the team effectiveness and not the individual. Now, the other thing you really need to think about is safety. The process of reporting can be really traumatic. I felt nauseous when I was rehearsing to tell some of my stories here. And that's at a fraction of what's going on for people who are reporting it immediately after they happen. So focus on everything you can do to make them feel safe. And in particular, you need to focus on not allowing any kind of retaliation or any kind of pressure for them to work it out or be okay with it. Do not make them go to lunch with their harasser. Do not make them feel pressure to accept compromises that they do not feel safe with. But you also need to balance victim needs and consistency of policy, and that can be really, really challenging. If you have limited time, focus your effort on managers. That's who's driving the individual experience of most people day to day. And mostly they've gotten dropped into management without much training, managing their peers, their former peers, and having had lots of bad modeling. That really sucks. Invest in their training, their support, and their mentorship. And you also really want to encourage bystander action. Traditional training that focuses on just what's legal and illegal and just on managers is probably ineffective at best. But there's some research that shows that training that focuses on teaching people if they're bystanders to some kind of harassment, how to recognize it and how to intervene and how to help after the fact is much more effective. And it makes sense because it's much more positive and it gives people a sense of what they can do. It goes back to that concrete plans type of advice that I gave previously. And I certainly saw bystander action really kick in several times and congregate in positive ways. Unfortunately, I don't have time to tell the stories here. And I know I've given you a lot, but you don't have to tackle it all at once, and not all of it is going to be appropriate for your company. 10-person studios are totally different from a 10,000 person big publisher, but you need to start somewhere. So think about the principles that I've sort of conveyed and think about, okay, what works in our context? What can we do? What's going to be authentic to us? And if you're a manager within one of these larger organizations, think about, okay, I can't get everybody on board, but I can make my team feel safer. I can make my team feel better with my own leadership and my own communication. And as an individual bystander, I can learn how I might intervene or think that through and be ready to help. Leaders have the most impact, but everybody can do this, and we can do it gradually over time and make the industry better. And it's absolutely worth it. I was feeling depressed last year when I saw a whole wave of Me Too stories came out, and this popped up in my Twitter feed from a former Congregate employee, now at Big Peach Games actually, and she was posting about her good experience being harassed at a GDC party, actually our GDC party, where a ad network representative that we were working with showed up, started harassing her really aggressively, followed her around the bar. She got the bouncer to help get him out. I think he hit the bouncer. He definitely pulled the fire alarm. It was a whole scene. But she was very smart, and she had gotten his business card. And the next day we all came together and put together a plan, particularly Zoe, our HR manager, and the VP of marketing, to deal with it, and got statements from everybody, Zoe, the bar, a bunch of other witnesses, and put them together and took them to that ad network as a pretty package. And they verified that it happened, and 3 days later that guy was fired. And as Zoe says, a disturbing experience turned into something that felt really empowering. And so if you're in a position of power, be like everyone in that story, make the right thing happen. So thank you. Here are a list of resources and links. And as I said, I'm going to post the whole talk and the slides with all of my notes on Twitter at Emily G. Thank you very much.